Alex is a research fellow at the Institute for Economic Peace in Sydney, where his work is focused on peace and violence in Latin America, as well as the role of multilateral institutions and some current challenges and opportunities to fostering global governance. So he'll be speaking today about the role of public institutions in ensuring social well-being, asking specifically what the teachings of the Baha'i faith can offer to the global conversation about the role of governments in safeguarding their denizens' welfare. So thank you so much, Alex, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Malin, and a big thanks to the Association of Baha'i Studies UK for inviting me to participate. I am, as Malin mentioned, here in Sydney, Australia, where I just have been simultaneously watching the conclusion of the English national women's football team. For anyone who's waiting until the end of the seminar to see the results, I'll refrain from spoiling it. I'll just share my slides now. Malin, can you confirm that you can see these?
Yes, that's great.
Okay. Wonderful. So despite the title of my presentation, I think the ambitions of both this essay as well as the presentation itself are quite modest. It's an essay that was published a few years ago. So if anyone has read it, apologies. I'll mostly just be offering sort of a summary of its contents, but also hoping to give a bit of background that may be not contained in the paper itself. So interestingly, the paper was conceived and written in 2019, pre-pandemic. In the years prior, I kind of witnessed this growing sort of interest and concern in the question of government and public institutions' role in promoting social well-being, sort of harking back to some of the points that Maximilian was making. This notion of limited government as a central tenet of government was kind of increasingly being questioned. But then with the onset of the pandemic, a lot of these questions about government's position in ensuring the well-being of their citizens really came into much sharper relief. And sort of the objectives of the essay were not so much about contributing original research per se, but more about reframing and representing existing analyses and highlighting some gems in the Baha'i writings. So I think the first motivation in developing the paper was to sort of understand the position of the faith in relation to two modes of approaching social change. The first was sort of a civil society or community service driven approach. And as many of us are probably well aware, given the size and the non-political character of the Baha'i community, most of our sort of formalized and informal efforts towards social change have been a bit more aligned with this approach. But I think during some of my postgraduate studies and in other spheres, there's kind of this implicit or explicit critique of this notion of NGO-driven efforts to change the world as maybe being a reflection of so-called neoliberalism, this idea that it's not the government's role to improve society, that citizens should just be, that work should be outsourced to charities and non-governmental organizations, and governments can kind of take a step back and not have to assume those responsibilities. And I think kind of in thinking about this question, I came to reflect about this idea that in many people's minds, there's this idea that civil society or NGOs are perhaps more representative of the people than our elected representatives for those of us who live in democratic societies, which is kind of a strange notion because while they may be in some ways more in touch with the grassroots or more engaged in the concerns of certain groups, they are self-appointed essentially bodies. No one elects the membership of an NGO except for the membership of the NGO itself. So it's kind of this sort of strange paradox. And then I guess the other big approach was sort of the government or sort of statist-oriented approach to social change. And this has historically been the mode of change in certainly the 19th and 20th centuries. This idea that in order to affect social change, a group needs to take the state, needs to, or if not take the state, foster change within the state. So it's looking at these more major structural issues and these sorts of guaranteed provisions of social services and programs. And in circling back to this question of the Baha'i community's non-political character and some of our grassroots efforts at community service, I do remember over the years, especially in conversation with some friends in Europe, this notion of when we try to engage in say our junior youth group doing a service project or volunteer work of any kind, maybe a bit of pushback within certain sectors that no, that's the state's role. That's what the government is meant to do. We shouldn't be assuming these responsibilities. And again, particularly in the United States, with the election of 2016, there was sort of this resurgence of the idea of perhaps letting government take more of a role in ensuring social well-being, even in a country as suspicious of government as the United States. So the second motivation of developing the essay was to really just sort of highlight for a Baha'i readership, but also for the wider public, some of Abdul Baha's really compelling practical proposals, but also his larger vision for the construction of a more just, unified, and peaceful society. Because in light of prevalent discourses in that moment, it felt very relevant to dig out these gems and share them. So the essay sort of begins by looking at the question of the emergence of the welfare state, and I'll just provide a very sort of summary description of that narrative as it's outlined in the essay. So essentially, starting in the 19th century with the emergence of industrial capitalism, there was growing discourse and concern, particularly in Europe, about government's role in regulating and providing for society. And this was spurred by massive waves of people leaving the countryside and entering the urban labor force, which precipitated a lot of disruption of maybe traditional or communal modes of taking care of vulnerable people. And in this sort of context, we have the emergence of a lot of different socialist and communist ideas. Of course, the most prominent of those being by Karl Marx, which basically advocated for the collective ownership of the means of production in order to counter some of these new miseries, I guess, that the prevailing or the new prevailing order was bringing about. And against this backdrop, we have in late 19th century Germany, Otto von Bismarck basically leading the development of the creation of what we now know as the welfare state by providing social services on a range of issues, pensions, disability insurance, things of that sort. And following that experience over the first half of the 20th century, this pattern gradually expanded across much of many of the wealthy countries in the world, and then increasingly into lower income countries as well. So that by the middle of the 20th century, the welfare state had essentially become the norm in at least non-socialist or non-communist countries. But looking on a bit farther, by the 1970s, there was sort of the world was beginning to see a bit of a crack in the consensus around these ideas. This notion that government was well placed to solve or to take care of society across a range of issues was increasingly met with critique. People, or there are a growing number of voices led by figures like Milton Friedman were signaling that government was becoming bloated, that it was becoming unwieldy, and it should focus on a more circumscribed range of issues. And moving out of these sort of critiques, by the 1980s, the ideas of neoliberalism were increasingly guiding government policy, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom. And this, over the course of the next several decades, more or less succeeded in reshaping sort of the citizen government compact in many, if not most, countries around the world. And then if we look, I guess, at the sort of 21st century, the argument of the essay is that this basic citizen government contract has not fundamentally changed, but as was again alluded to in some of Maximilian's comments, there's been this growing sort of discontent with the established order. And this has been brought about by sort of compounding disruptions in the fields of technology, climate, economic inequality, unprecedented levels of migration. And it's quite interesting that against this backdrop, the notion of disruption itself has more and more been lauded as a social good. And I guess in the last few years, there's been a growing voices calling for, rather than disruption, greater social stability. And governments who were once providers of that security are currently sort of hampered by internal fighting or a lack of shared vision about government's place. And this has sort of brought about, I guess, a crisis of faith among many in the role of public institutions. And so this lack of shared vision is sort of the arena into which the essay endeavors to offer the Baha'i perspective. So the essay sort of talks about these two parallel revolutions that occurred in the 19th century. The first is the one that I just very summarily outlined, that occurred primarily in Europe with the revolution in the realm of political economy. And then the second one is the one that we're all very familiar with, a sort of what I'm calling here a socio-spiritual revolution that happened in sites across the Middle East, which of course was brought about by the Bab and Baha'u'llah opening a new chapter in religious history. And a kind of interesting point on this note is that it was exactly 1 month after the founding of the first, um, 1 month after the founding of the first socialist party in the world, that Baha'u'llah declared his mission in the Garden of Rizwan. So in seeking to understand the complementarity of these quote unquote parallel revolutions, Baha'u'llah's The Secret of Divine Civilization is of course an unequaled resource, because it of course outlines that these are not parallel or separate processes. These processes are interlinked and complementary, and the one derives force from the other, and uh, both need to be understood in conjunction in order for lasting solutions to be identified. And also in developing the essay, this was a very important, if not essential, resource in answering the fundamental question about whether it's government or whether it's civil society that needs to lead processes of social change. Now, in revisiting The Secret of Divine Civilization, it became clear that the book itself and Abdul-Baha does not state categorically where the provision of social well-being should come from. It is directed at the entirety of Persian society at that time, calling for the education and regeneration of moral principle at all levels of society. And Abdul-Baha puts a lot more emphasis on the idea that the needs of the needy be met rather than who provides for those needs. So, for example, he outlines scenarios in which an altruistic individual could bring about the upliftment of the masses. This could be a private citizen. It wouldn't have to be necessarily from government. But despite this, Abdul-Baha nevertheless makes clear that ultimate responsibility for social well-being falls on government and leadership, stating that it is the monarch on whose high resolve the welfare of all his subjects depends. The Secret of Divine Civilization does not put forward a concrete blueprint for the creation of a new socio-political system. As with the faith more generally, it's much more focused on the idea of developing new modes of social engagement and collective decision-making, which would be capable of giving rise to such a system. So in addition to sort of answering that overarching question, the essay then delves into some of the glimpses of a more harmonious, unified, just world that is on humanity's horizon, and specifically some of the practical proposals in Abdul-Baha's writings and recorded utterances that could potentially be implemented in such a society. So, as we all are well aware, in the past few years, past decade or so, there's been rising concerns about income inequality in an array of societies, and this is true not only within countries but across countries. The inequality between high income and low income countries, the inequality within high income countries, the inequality within low income countries, etc. So of course, the central Baha'i principle of the elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty is extremely relevant today. Abdul-Baha in his writings emphasizes the sort of destabilizing impact that extreme inequality can have. He, of course, warns against total equalization, meaning all people being forcibly given the same amount of income through some sort of coercive means, while at the same time stressing the injustice of both extreme equality, extreme wealth and extreme poverty. And he was speaking and writing, especially in terms of his time in the Western world, at a time of comparable inequality. There is just to share one statistic. When he was in the United States in 1912, there have been analyses putting the level of annual income of the top 1% of society at around 1/5 of the entirety of the society's income. And in the subsequent decades, through legislative and other means, that ratio declined significantly. But over the last several decades, it has once again creeped up and exceeded the levels that were witnessed at Abdu'l-Baha's time. And if you were to look at the question of wealth rather than income, the levels of inequality become much, much greater. So in regard to this issue, Abdu'l-Baha does, in a number of his statements, identify legislative action as the primary means to rectifying extreme equality. Just to share one quotation, he states, "There must be special laws made dealing with these extremes of riches and of want. This is the only way in which the deplorable superfluity of great wealth and miserable, demoralizing, degrading poverty can be abolished." He also refers to such action as, quote, "the greatest means for promoting such social equity." Now, in speaking about income inequality in the world at large, usually the first point that is identified as a means, a legislative means of achieving it, is through progressive taxation, which is a system that traces its origins to the United Kingdom during the wars with Napoleon, in which taxes were levied on a sort of on a progressive basis in order to execute the war. And in the context of a village, Abdu'l-Baha proposes an example of a 5-tiered progressive taxation scheme in which those whose needful expenses was equivalent to their income would pay nothing in tax, and those within the village who had the highest levels of income relative to their needful expenses would pay 1/2 of their income in tax. And between those two bounds, he outlines scenarios of a person paying 1/4, 1/10, 1/3, etc., of their wealth to the community. And he highlights that this would likely be different or more complex in a high income urban setting. It might be the case that in a non-village setting, the rates of taxation would be higher. But again, I should emphasize, he merely outlines that 5-tiered system as an example, not as a prescription. Now, it's important to highlight that this vision that Abdu'l-Baha outlines relies crucially on high levels of social trust and a strong sense within the community that individual well-being is tied to collective prosperity. The recipient of these taxes would be what he terms a community storehouse, and this would be composed of local people who are trustworthy and could be known to administer the funds fairly. But in describing this storehouse, he outlines a scenario in which all members of the community would be simultaneously potential contributors and potential beneficiaries. Now, on the second point, sort of related to taxation, we have this question of voluntary giving. And Abdul Baha he distinguishes voluntary sharing from equalization caused by coercion, in the case of, say, like a violent revolution or something of that kind. And of course advocates for a person giving of their own free will to the storehouse or to society at large. He says, man reacheth perfection through good deeds voluntarily performed, not through good deeds, the doing of which was forced upon him. And sharing is a personally chosen righteous act. That is, the rich should extend assistance to the poor. They should expend their substance for the poor, but of their own free will, and not because the poor have gained this end by force. So in reading this quotation and quotations like this, there are sort of two modes that a person could interpret them with. On the one hand, there's a very sort of individualistic interpretation in which this quotation would say any wealthy person can exercise their individual discretion about whether or not he or she would like to give voluntarily or pay taxes voluntarily to society at large, to the government, or to whatever body is administering to the needs of the community. But I think a more sort of compelling vision or interpretation of this quotation is the idea that the wealthy classes as a whole would perhaps in some future take the decision to voluntarily submit to, say, higher rates of taxation or higher rates of giving, with the understanding that their own well-being is deeply tied to the well-being of sort of the most vulnerable in their society. And I don't think I have time to delve into great depth, but it's, I think, important to realize that the Baha'i vision of taxation probably finds its most complete and highest expression in the law of Huququllah, which, as we all know, requires the payment of 19% of a person's wealth or income beyond their needful expenses to the center of the faith. And sort of the third point tackled in the essay with regard to some of these practical proposals for creating a more just and prosperous society that really takes care of all people's social well-being is in relation to decent work. So in the middle part of the last century, many middle-class people in high-income countries could count on, decent, secure, and well remunerated jobs across classes, actually, in manufacturing and agriculture and professional services, etc. But in the last 10 or 20 years, that has increasingly been changing, driven, by globalization, automation, and other factors. We see this increasing restructuring of the labor force. We have the rise of what's been called the gig economy, in which people work short term or on contract basis and maybe are not able to count on a steady income or the benefits of having sort of a longer term job. And there's, I guess, a rising levels of anxiety resulted with this restructuring. And the essay was written, as I mentioned a few years ago. It touched on this question of artificial intelligence and its capacity to replicate or exceed the capacities of the human brain in many domains. And just given that we're now living in even just a few years later, a different era with ChatGPT and related programs and services, I thought it was worth mentioning that in developing this PowerPoint presentation, I actually went to ChatGPT and asked it to give me some bullet points just to see what it might do. And it did an excellent job. And much of what you've read and looked at over the past few minutes was produced by ChatGPT reading the essay and producing this with some human modifications. But I think, at least in my work and in probably the work of many other people, there is this increasing anxiety that we will be replaced by artificial intelligence, and that this may pose a challenge to the workforce. So, as with the question of extreme inequality in relation to decent work, Abdul Baha spoke at a time of comparable transformations. But against that backdrop, he offers a vision of fair remuneration, shorter working hours, and increased leisure, actually driven by these labor-saving machines. He says, the first decided shortening of the hours will appear when a legal working day of 8 hours is established. But this working day of 8 hours is only the beginning. Soon there will be a 6-hour day, a 5-hour, a 3-hour, even less than that, and the worker must be paid for the management of machines, more for this management of machines than he ever received for the exercise of his 2 hands alone. So I thought it was quite interesting to highlight this. It's interesting to note that very shortly after Abdul Baha stated this, in the United States, President Woodrow Wilson decreed that all federal employees of the federal government would be switched to an 8-hour day, and that subsequently became the norm across the United States, and then across most of the industrialized world. And with regard to the latter part of his predictions, there have been in recent years a growing number of experiments with shorter working days. There was an experiment in a retirement home in Sweden several years back, in which some of the nurses within the retirement community were switched to a 6-hour workday, while the rest continued to work their normal 8 hours. And what was found was that the productivity of those whose workday was shortened increased by around 60%. The number of sick days that they took fell by half. And actually the quality of the care they were able to offer to patients improved. So I think there's a growing number of companies and countries that are looking at experiences like this and starting to seriously consider shortening the workday, for example, to 6 hours, but maybe in the next few decades we can all enjoy a 3-hour workday, which would be fantastic. And with regard to the last phrase about the management of machines resulting in higher compensation to the humans doing this work, probably to date that has not really been the case. It's mostly been the owners of companies who are benefiting from the cost savings of new technologies. But as Abdul Baha lays out, there may be sort of sea change at some point in the near or distant future that allows for common people, common workers to benefit from this change in dynamic. So Abdul Baha also highlighted that in realizing some of these changes, government really played a central, or would have to play a central role in managing changes in labor relations and wage issues. As with progressive taxation, he advocated legislative means for this to be realized. And he also pointed to systems of employee share ownership to foster fair compensation, but to crucially allow workers to feel a sense of identification with their labor, to which they might otherwise feel alienated. So the essay sort of concludes with this question of new modes of governance based on consultation. And I think it's important to highlight that most of the practical proposals outlined in the preceding slides are not really unique to the Baha'i writings. Many of them have been discussed in policy circles for quite a while. But there is sort of a unique contribution that I think is quite distinctive in the writings of the faith. And it essentially has to do with how we move towards these solutions, which may well have already been dreamt up, but we just lack the means and the collective will to implement. So at present, in the best of cases, questions of governance are approached in terms of a debate. And the explicit objective of a debate is not to arrive at truth, but it is to win. And in the current political climate, even the idea of debate, sincere debate in certain countries has become increasingly rare, because in a debate, one side is supposed to at least concede or acknowledge the points raised by the other side, and address them and sort of speak to them. But what we see increasingly in many countries around the world is that when a conflicting perspective or view is presented, the other side will simply not engage, but rather revert to talking points and just act as though no counterpoint had been articulated. And so you kind of have just two sides talking past each other. And this is really where the Baha'i conception of consultation is so powerful, more so than any, say, policy proposal, and in my view presents the greatest potential contribution to the reshaping of the functioning of public institutions. So as Baha'is know, consultation is fundamental to everything we do, and we have this notion that it provides the best means for arriving at decisions of shared import. But I think also importantly, it ensures that plans can be implemented in unity. And this is crucial because it allows for the merit of a plan to actually be known. I think in many government programs currently in many parts of the world, a service or initiative might be implemented, but it is immediately met by dissenting voices which seek to undermine and sabotage the implementation. And so whether or not the plan or proposal has any validity sort of remains obscure. And in contrast, in a consultative space where whether or not the person, one side initially agreed with the implementation, it is pursued in unity, in which case, if the initiative does not work, it can be objectively evaluated and either refined or discarded. But as we all know, consultation is not just a series of steps. It also has to be precipitated and accompanied by a whole set of values and attitudes, which allows a person to move beyond sort of begrudging negotiation or even amicable compromise, and really sincerely set aside their own preferences, their own desires, for the will of the community. So for this reason, as suggested by The Secret of Divine Civilization, what is truly needed is the fostering of a new ethic of leadership and governance. And on that note, I would just like to end with a quotation from Abdul Baha from the end of The Secret of Divine Civilization. He says, "The world of politics is like the world of man." Sorry, the world of politics is like the world of man. He is a seed at first, and then passes by degrees to the conditions of embryo and fetus, acquiring a bone structure, being clothed with flesh, taking on his own special form, until at last he reaches the plane where he can befittingly fulfill the words, "the most excellent of makers." Just as this is a requirement of creation and is based on the universal wisdom, the political world in the same way cannot instantaneously evolve from the nadir of defectiveness to the zenith of rightness and perfection. Rather, qualified individuals must strive day by day and by night, using all those means which will conduce to progress until the government and the people develop along every line, from day to day, and even from moment to moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was brilliant. And I think really such a good presentation to end the first session of our day, because it really seemed to tie together for me a lot of the themes which have been being brought up by some of our other speakers, especially very close to the end where you bring up the principle of consultation. I think for a lot of the participants, it will have been really interesting to hear from Paddy, the UK NSA Secretary, this morning about how actively a National Spiritual Assembly, and obviously on a much higher level, the Universal House of Justice, are really sort of putting into practice this principle of consultation, and just seeing how possible it is actually in practice where there's real unity of vision and consensus. We don't have time for loads of questions, but I will begin by asking you one, which was sent in. Hi, Alex. Do you think AI would actually free us up in the work week to contribute more to social change? This may result in some professions being eradicated, many being manual work. What role does equality of access to education throughout all stages of life have in our ever-changing work life? So I guess kind of a couple of questions rolled into one there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly don't know the long-term impacts of AI. I think I know it's changed the way I work. Most of the people that I work with, it's changed the way they work, and I think there is real concern that in the short term, it could cause a lot of pain in a lot of professions. I think it will require, based on my reading of what Abdul Baha says, it will require institutions, organizations, making a decision about how they want to treat their employees, what sort of provisions they want to make for their employees, and deciding that, you know, the well-being of their workforce, you know, trumps the desire to automate everything, or maybe just a sort of, I think what will probably end up happening is a rebalancing. There's been technological innovations which have decimated certain industries and just rendered them obsolete, and it likely will be the case that certain industries will become more or less obsolete in the coming decades. But I think I hold on to the promise that Abdu'l-Baha outlines that at some point in the future, maybe not within our lifetimes, but maybe there will be sort of collective action to ensure that that workers are considered crucial to government, to company profits, and that it's within owners' best interest to strike the right balance.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was very, very interesting to hear Abdu'l-Baha's perspective on that. Okay, so I think we've actually reached a perfect 2:15. So we're running on time, and so I think we'll now take a 45 or maybe slightly under 45-minute break. So we'll come back a couple of minutes before 3 o'clock, and we'll be watching a film which was developed for the British Baha'is, well, and indeed for everybody, but about the British Baha'i community. So thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to all of our speakers from this morning, and I hope that everybody rejoins us for the afternoon.
Thank you so much.